Welcome to the FEMCAST. We're more than just a podcast, we are a movement, fueled by the voices, ideas and stories of women from all walks of life. We're here to amplify your voice, empower your ideas and ignite change. This is a platform where your story matters, whether it's celebrating success, overcoming adversity or raising awareness on issues that shape our world. By subscribing, commenting or reviewing, you help us grow our community so we can continue bringing these important conversations to the forefront. Connect with us across social media at the FEMCAST and be part of a growing community striving for equality. Join our mission. Share your story. This is the FEMCAST, where your voice leads the way. Get ready for a powerful conversation with Carrie Bower, a fierce advocate for older women impacted by domestic abuse. As a domestic abuse policy lead, Carrie is on a mission to shine a light on the often overlooked experiences of women in later life. Too often we forget that women age into domestic violence and their struggles remain largely unaddressed. Carrie's work is dedicated to changing that narrative. She doesn't just raise awareness, she's the voice behind the blog and podcast Let's Get Visible, and was instrumental in a groundbreaking report, No Age Limit, The Hidden Face of Domestic Abuse. With her expertise as an accredited victim-focused trainer and a long career in social work, Carrie is making invisible women visible. Tune in to learn how she's tackling this crucial issue and what we can do to continue with her work as a community. This is the FEMCAST. You're very welcome to the podcast, Carrie. How are you today?
Thank you, Anita.
Okay, would you like to tell us about yourself, your personal journey, how you got here and how you focus on domestic violence in later life for women, and how you set up the knowyourplace.uk, and of course talk about your podcast as well and how you're helping women in later life?
Sure. Oh, where do you start? It's an interesting one, really. My kind of career-wise, I've always found myself pretty much most of my working life working with older women in various roles. So working in the NHS, working as a social worker, working in a charity. I've always had contact with older women. Been really, really fortunate. And so I've been really privileged to have some really deep, difficult, emotive, challenging conversations with women. But I started to see a bit of a theme. And then I sort of reflected on my childhood as well and some conversations I'd had with older relatives and older women in my life as a child. And it's been sort of over the last, 5 or 10 years that I've had a real awakening. And I think that's probably coincided with my perimenopause as well. So sort of hitting midlife and feeling, you start to think about your own mortality, your own aging. And so all of those kind of early childhood experiences, along with professional experiences, left me really passionate about the women that I have had those conversations with, where they were describing behaviour that is now considered coercive control or domestic abuse. But at the time, we didn't have that language. And so I want to...
For those who may not know what coercive control is, do you want to just say it?
Yeah, so coercive controlling behaviour is a crime. It's a criminal offence. It became a criminal offence in England and Wales. I'm not quite sure if it covers Ireland as well.
No, we have our own.
Okay, so it's a pattern of behaviours. It can be a series of incidents or a pattern of behaviours. This isn't the formal legal definition, but it can creep up over time. Yeah. And often the intention is to exert power and control over another person. And that behaviour can look and feel very different to different people. It can be rules, rituals, routines, consequences, all of these intentional acts to derail a person and make them question their sanity, their autonomy. And so it's become a criminal offence, but we still actually, a lot of professionals and members of the public don't really know what that looks like, and certainly not what that feels like. And it can be really, really difficult for a person who's been subjected to coercive controlling behaviour to see it themselves. And I have a blog called You Can't See the Wood for the Trees, because actually when you're in it, it's really, really difficult to see what's actually happening to you. So I've had these conversations with all these women over the years, over the decades that I've been working with different women. And this was kind of a bit of a passion project to make sense of it myself and to put it down on paper to articulate what that was for those women.
So, so in your work, Carrie, and you're coming across women, some of them, because I suppose, I don't know whether I'm articulating this properly or not. People view domestic violence as a younger woman's, a game is the wrong word, but issue. They see it, well, the highest rate is in the 18 to 25-year-old. And they think maybe early 30s, late 30s at best. But we have women aging into it in their 70s and 80s. And I can't even imagine my 70-odd-year-old mother having to deal with that. It must be heartbreaking to actually be in front of those women and listen to their stories. Some of them, especially when there was no physical violence and they had no language for it, and we didn't have the word coercive and controlling behavior, the words even, to explain that to them. And I suppose they probably diminished their own trauma because it wasn't physical. Do you find that?
Yeah, very much. So many of the women, particularly when you're talking about an intimate partner and that behaviour occurring over decades, for many of the women I've spoken to, they might have got married very, very young in life. That partner might have been their first and only intimate partner. You think about a woman who is 90 now, she'd have been born in mid-1930s, so pre-Second World War. A real period of time. She will have grown up, she will have been sort of 20s in the 50s, that post-war time. There were certain expectations placed on women. They were, expected to be silent, expected to put their husband's needs before their own. That was really normal. And so, there were terms and phrases like behind closed doors. That was really expected. Often women didn't speak to one another, and if they did, it might be their extended family. They might have had support, but not from formal services. We didn't have the laws and the language. But also women were completely dependent on their husbands or their fathers. They couldn't take out loans, couldn't take out mortgages, often weren't expected to work when they got married. So there's a real kind of normalisation of man's needs come first, and often violence was used, physical violence, but not only physical violence, just maybe control, marital rape wasn't a crime until the 1990s. So if you think about that woman in her 90s, born in the 1930s, she'd have been near retirement age before marital rape became a crime. So the majority of her adult life, these were normalised behaviours, normalised expectations. And so probably if she did speak out to a friend, family member, professional, there might have been support, but more likely they'll have been diminished and told to shut up and get on with it, basically. And so if you've had that messaging all your life, you learn to manage the risks, modify your own behaviour and stay as safe as you can. And I think the reality is there's probably many, many women that have lived a life like this, a miserable life that we don't really know about.
Yeah, it's interesting to say, or to hear you say, like, modify your behavior.
Yeah.
So you're working around the perpetrator and the abuser.
Constantly treading on eggshells, managing risk, becoming a complete expert in keeping yourself safe, because staying probably is the safest thing to do when there aren't services, there isn't validation, there isn't the support out there. Escaping is really risky. We know that now, don't we? We know that the end of a relationship is a really, really risky time. And even though many of those women might not have been able to articulate and have the right language, they will have instinctively known how to keep themselves safe.
Mm. Do you feel that, with some of the cases where they're referred to and wrongly mercy killings, oh, she was getting on, she had dementia, um, and people go, oh, that poor man, that poor woman, he put her out of her misery, so she wouldn't have known what was going on.
Yeah.
I think we're being fed the wrong narrative here and story headlines.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there obviously will be exceptions. There will be. There will be occasions where agreements have been made privately, or that, that person is under a huge amount of strain and stress. Often what we see, particularly with older people, is when they are killed, it's often overkill is used. There's a huge amount of violence used. But we naturally, I think, don't want to think about it, because the reality is any one of us can age and any one of us could therefore be at risk. But also, it's too difficult, isn't it? It's too uncomfortable. The thought that a woman has endured decades of abuse without anybody realising. And if we think about, there's the 8-stage homicide timeline from Dr. Jane Monckton Smith. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but she talks about the kind of trigger of a loss of control.
Yeah. Would you please explain that for the listeners? Because I'm aware of it, but people that are listening may not be aware of it.
Yeah, so she talks about kind of domestic homicide. So that's where somebody is killed by a partner, former partner, or family member. And Dr. Jane Monckton Smith sets out 8 stages and actually says there's patterns. When we reflect on these deaths, these killings, there is a definite pattern. There is usually a history. There are certain behaviours that the perpetrator displays. And one of the stages, and I can't remember which one it is, I think it's 5 or 6, is this kind of change of thinking, this trigger, and it's usually a loss of control. So what Dr. Jane Monckton Smith says is that in over 90% of all of these killings, there is coercive control at the very core of that relationship. Whoever, that relationship is between, the coercive control is the kind of the high risk factor. But actually, a lot of references...
Even if there was no violence before it.
Yes. Yes. So that's the key indicator. So we focus too much on violence and not, on coercive control. And actually, if we think about that loss of control, often people automatically think, oh, that must be separation. And often that is the case. We know that the risk increases when there's a separation. And often when you look back on domestic homicides, that will often be the case. But when we're thinking about older people, there are other periods in our life where we lose control. Things like retirement, a change of purpose, a change of income, a couple suddenly being together all of the time, maybe ill health, a long-term health condition. All of these are potential triggers in that 8-stage homicide timeline. So a perpetrator who, for instance, has been married for 50 years and has maintained power and control. So, wife hasn't been able to escape. There hasn't been support services. She's modified her behaviour. He's exerted full power and control. Possibly abuse hasn't needed to escalate because he's got full control. Actually, he retires. He loses his sense of self. He might have a health condition. She might develop a health condition. And so that's a time when that person might feel there is a loss of control. And again, that could be a trigger for a change in thinking, where actually homicide, killing might be an option. But for many, it won't be. And that person won't go on to kill. But the abuse may escalate, the control, because there's that fear of loss of control. So that's kind of one particular area, but I'm really conscious that we don't just focus on people who are killed, because for every person that's killed, there'll be thousands of people living, existing. And that's what the blog, what Know Your Place is really about, is kind of telling those stories of invisible women who are never, ever going to be able to speak their truth. And I've been really fortunate that I've had conversations with women at the very end of life. And often I find it's in those last few days that they start to share some of their experiences.
Oh. Imagine leaving this world with all that trauma in your little body.
Yeah.
That's just so sad. You know, instead of looking back and going, well, I did this and I put my children to college or I traveled the world. The thing they most want to talk about is the experience they had going on. I suppose it's maybe a bit cleansing as well for them going onto the next journey. Maybe that's how they view it. But that's really heartbreaking. Have you ever spoken to men of that generation and why they do it? Have you ever been in a setting where the older men have carried on abuse and you've actually had engagement with them?
No, I haven't at all. And I am going to be interviewing somebody on my podcast about that very thing quite soon. You know, why perpetrators behave the way that they do. But I believe that many perpetrators thrive. They get rewarded for exerting power and control. We live in a society where perpetrators do very well in their careers, are very charming. And so if that's your learned behaviour, that works for you, that's successful, you get what you want, you get rewarded, you might get joy out of and pleasure out of exerting power and control. Why would you stop if you're not challenged, if you're not interrupted? Possibly a sense of entitlement. So actually that thought process isn't even there. Even that recognition, how they're behaving is in some way abusive. It may well be they're entitled to behave that way. That's how they've always behaved.
Yeah. But you see with the murders and the femicide, it's that sense of entitlement that they get up that day and they commit those crimes with no regard for the devastation they're going to leave, not just on that one life, the ripple effect in families and generations come, because it goes on and the hurt and the trauma.
Yeah.
Actually, can we talk a bit about trauma? Because you have done trauma training and you do talks on this. I'd love to get into the trauma on domestic violence victims and the healing from it.
Yeah, so a few years ago, I'd been reading quite a lot of Dr. Jessica Taylor's work and also Gabor Mate's work. Really found that really, really interesting. A lot of that kind of looking at the way victims of domestic abuse, child abuse, sexual abuse and rape, so a variety of forms of abuse, are traumatised, but often reframed as ill. So I call that pathologisation. So it's that pathologisation of trauma. And often what happens is professionals tell that person they're not well, but also that person is told by their perpetrator they're not well. And then that's internalised. So that's where a lot of the self-blame comes in. They start to believe that actually what's happened to me might be my fault, or it might not be as bad as I think it is. And so we sort of have this vicious cycle where that victim survivor is not only modifying their behaviour, managing risk, hypervigilant, constantly trying to juggle risk, they're also questioning their sanity. They might even be medicated. They might have been given lots of labels, which then reinforces, well, I'm thinking this way or I'm behaving this way because these are my symptoms, rather than thinking, actually, I'm responding really rationally here to what's happened to me. And women, women I've spoken to in mid and later life, very rarely have experienced one trauma. It can be multiple traumas. And we've all, if we're really honest with ourselves, been subjected to multiple forms of trauma. Oppression, misogyny, for some racism, disableism. There's lots of traumas that we don't even see as traumas. We think it's the big stuff, the big, car accident, a loss to somebody very, catastrophically, or child abuse or rape. We think about these kind of major incidents, but actually we live in a world that's pretty traumatic. We're exposed to the news all of the time. We've all been subjected to a pandemic, a global pandemic, which was traumatic. So if we think about it in the context of our own kind of normal everyday life, how we respond to, for instance, let's think about the pandemic, because that's kind of a shared collective experience. We all experienced it really differently. All of us have different levels of privilege and oppression. So that was a really, really challenging time for most people. But some people responded in one way and some responded differently. And it's the same with kind of any trauma. We respond differently. We're all unique, and we'll all respond differently at different times in our life and depending on the support systems we have in place. What we find is really common is a woman particularly, and I'm not suggesting men don't experience this, but I'm speaking as a woman. When you have been abused, harmed, abused by a loved one, raped, sexually assaulted, it's very, very rare for you not to be given a diagnosis of some mental health condition.
Right. So those that are thinking, I've got mental health problems and aren't trauma informed, and our GPs aren't trauma informed. Gabor Mate talks about that a lot as a GP, and they were looking at women, especially 80% of the diseases are from trauma.
Yeah. And that's, the physical diseases as well, autoimmune diseases, absolutely.
Yeah. And our doctors aren't trauma informed, our court systems are trauma informed, our judges making decisions on whether perpetrators are allowed back into the home where vulnerable children are and women. And I don't know, what will it take for society to say we need to trauma inform these people so that we're not sending women on a wild goose chase to go after this treatment and that treatment, when in fact they don't need the medication. They need to be heard and seen that they're suffering from abuse, and this is what it does to their body. Jen Fraser does it in her book, The Bullied Brain, and how the neuroscience behind what happens to the brain. If you're in the age group that you're dealing with as well, they won't have access to the internet, and they won't have access to all this other material that could help them. So they're going into the world every day and moving through the world thinking there is something wrong with them.
Particularly if they've been subjected to domestic abuse for decades, because they'll be very isolated, because we know that that's standard with a perpetrator, that they'll be really, really isolated and limited. So even if, and not all older people don't have access to the internet, but if you are in an abusive relationship, you're probably very controlled, and what you read, what you see, what you hear on the radio will be very, very controlled. So your access to these conversations will be very limited.
Thank you for tuning in. If you're enjoying this episode, we'd love for you to subscribe and join our growing community. By subscribing, you're helping us bring these important stories to the forefront and giving us the chance to book incredible guests who share their powerful insights. We value each and every one of our community, and your support helps us deliver the best content possible. So hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this movement together. We're in this with you. Let's amplify these voices and keep the conversation going. On raising visibility, Carrie, what strategies have you found most effective for women, older women affected by domestic violence?
Storytelling. That's definitely been the most impactful. I think helping me to make sense of what I know, but also the feedback that I've had. So when I started telling stories, and they're fictional stories, but they are based on, reality, real conversations, I realised very quickly people contacted me privately and said, that could be my story. You've written 30 stories and 15 of them could be my own. And I think when you hear that, you suddenly think, oh, wow, okay, I am onto something here. And that's really powerful. And when you start to realise that many of the women that I've spoken to recently who maybe aren't currently in abusive relationships, but, are healing and trying to process what they've been through, they say just reading those stories alone has been really validating. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate what women need. Actually, what they want is to be validated, to be acknowledged, to be believed. They can often do the work themselves because it'll be unique for every woman. Some people need therapy, specialist services, but many find comfort in just knowing they're not alone. And so what started off with was, fictional stories, which I wrote and then developed into a podcast, now has created actually women who want to tell me their own stories. So very, very careful and cautious about how we do that and make sure that they're safe to do that and ready to do that. But now actually hearing from other women across the world, that's kind of phase 2 of this project, which has been really, really powerful as well. And then they're feeling that they are also making sense of their experience, but then also helping the next person that listens or reads.
Isn't it incredible storytelling?
Yeah.
And you think about all the science that's out there, the medication, the training, everything, and it's just actually speaking those words and letting it out into the air. And that nod from somebody sitting across you and going, I hear you. I know what it feels like. And you're not alone.
Yeah. Really, really powerful.
Very, very, very powerful. I was with a centre one day. We were in doing training and they had said this 60-odd-year-old woman, she can't leave because she's no money. And she just comes up. So she lives with it every day. And I just found, like, here we have 9 counties without refuges. Wow. I don't know what it's like in the UK, but I'm sure they're at capacity as well. Do you find when you speak to them that they say, how do I get out? Or have I left it too late? Will I ever get?
Yeah, and it's a tricky one because I think sometimes we make assumptions that because women have been in that situation for such a long time, they don't want to leave. And actually, it's not that they don't want to leave. They've not been able to escape. There's been no option. And so they've created a home and a place that they feel as safe as they can. So we shouldn't assume that escaping isn't something that older women want. But often the alternative it is really scary. Refuges often aren't set up for older people for a variety of reasons. They might be away from their networks. And if you think about it, as we grow older, our lives become more complicated, our relationships become more complicated, our friendships, our connections. And so to expect a woman in her 70s, 80s, 90s to walk away from that is a big ask. But also refugees might have children there, might have very young children, women who are very traumatized themselves and going through their own trauma might not be the right environment for somebody who is later in life. And so there's lots of reasons why that's really, really complicated. There are a couple of specialist services in England, but there's not many.
Oh, so there is services for the older generation.
To be honest, Denisa, I'm not actually aware of many services.
That's sad.
There's about 5 in the whole of the UK and they're really small. And I don't think they have specialist refuges.
There's none here.
No.
The talks that you're doing, Carrie, where do you do them and who are they for? So the talks that you do, Carrie, and the talks and the training that you do, who are they aimed at? Who are they for? Is it social workers? Is it people in the legal system? Is it the women that are aging into it? Do these come to these talks and access these courses? Or can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so, I will speak to any group of professionals that want to hear about this topic. that's the reality, is we all need to be talking about this topic. Anybody that has a touch point with an older person, and that literally could be anybody, couldn't it? Because older people aren't a homogenous group, they represent all of us. So I will speak to anybody that's willing to listen. The work that we do in the charity that I work for, this isn't our specialist area. I'm one person in a really large charity. But what generally happens is an older person might have a trusted relationship with somebody working there. And so they might start to open up. So it's really, really important that whoever that person trusts, when they do speak out, if they want to reach out and have these conversations, that we don't shut the door. So actually, anybody I can speak to, but I work with lots of organisations, so police, social workers, health professionals, other charity workers, GPs, pharmacists, district nurses, literally anybody that might have contact with an older person. I'm more than happy to speak to and talk not only about kind of the statistics, the research, or the kind of quantitative stuff, but actually the storytelling, because that's where the real kind of impact often is.
Yeah. And you did that training with Dr. Jessica Taylor.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was brilliant. So it was 40 hours, I think, of training over a month. So it's quite intense. And we covered lots of topics. So it wasn't specific to older people. It was around kind of the pathologization of mental health and trauma, victim blaming and self-blame around sexual assault and rape. So very, very key topics. But what I've been able to do is extract that learning and then apply it to the work that I do with older people. Because I think historically, if we think back to the kind of 50s, 60s, 70s and beyond, many, many women were admitted into large day institutions with mental health conditions. And actually, if you read their medical records, if you got to know those women, you will have found abuse and trauma at the core most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. So having that kind of trauma-informed understanding has really helped me to apply that to the work that I do with older people.
It's unreal that your husband back then could ring the authorities and they would come and pick you up and just lock you up and have you sectioned, and you'd have to get their permission again to come back out.
Yeah. And you think about, go back even further, witch hunts, witches were killed, weren't they? If they were ambitious or
outspoken.
That was it, yeah. Then they were classed as witches. They were all women.
Yeah. And powerful women.
Yes.
If you've ever read the book by Niamh Boyce called For Kind, it's the first witch trial in Ireland. I think it was the first witch trial across the world, actually. But she was powerful and had money. And the bishops didn't like that.
Yeah. Speak out of turn and you're a witch.
So tell us a bit about knowyourplace.uk.
Okay, so knowyourplace.uk is kind of my little passion project. It's a hobby. It's something I do outside of my working role. So I work for a national charity as a domestic abuse lead. And this is something that I kind of throw all my creative energy into. And it's kind of visibly experimenting with ideas. So there isn't really a plan. I started off with Know Your Place. It was a blog. So it was a series called Invisible Women. And that was these fictional stories, all with titles. So titles that are familiar phrases. So things like a fly in the ointment, can't see the wood for the trees, 6 of one and half a dozen of the other. What's another one?
You made your bed.
That's it. You made your bed, now lie in it. You reap what you sow, a thorn in my side. So these are all phrases that are really familiar. And then it takes you on a journey with a woman and her experience of domestic abuse or some form of trauma. So usually a domestic abuse, but it might be child abuse as well, and how she's been reframed as ill mad. And so their stories, I ask questions, and they're meant to be there to kind of validate people's experiences, as we said before, but also for professionals. So ask trauma-informed questions so that it really starts to get the reader to think critically about that woman's situation. That's how it started, Know Your Place. And then it kind of evolved. So then I got the Visible Women series, which was women who were in my network who wanted to talk about their careers and their confidence and the inner voice that kind of keeps us all very quiet and not speaking out. And a lot of those women also have their own experience of trauma. So they will weave that into the conversation. So that was just a series of interviews I did with them. And then I started a podcast. And that was the beginning of this year. So it was only kind of 8 months ago. I love podcasts, always have done. And I thought, actually, this is all about finding your voice and being visible. So let's kind of push the boundaries a bit. And I've started just reading those stories so that they were auditory, so people could listen to them. But then very quickly, people would contact me and say, I'd like to come and talk to you on your podcast. I'd like to talk to you about my experience, either as a professional or as a victim survivor, and often as both. So often what I'm finding is many, many professionals want to talk to me about their own experience and how maybe it's shaped their choice of career, why they've taken on activism, what they're doing. So it's kind of evolved. There's been a few ideas that haven't worked, but it's kind of just gradually evolved over time. And I don't quite know what's going to happen next. So Let's Get Visible is kind of, at the moment, the podcast that sits on the website, knowyourplace.uk. And that's in series, so I've just finished series 6.
Congratulations.
Yeah, and I do that as a hobby. I don't quite know where Know Your Place is going. But I think that's also quite exciting. And what I've found is I've been guided by people in my network who've given me ideas. So Blue Van Woman is in the Indomitable Women section. So if you look on the website, there's all these different sections. And she is a woman in her 70s who I met at a Violence Against Women and Girls book club. And she's currently doing a PhD in creative writing. And she's also a survivor of domestic abuse. And we got chatting and I told her about my blog. And she said, oh, I'd love to do something. I've just bought a camper van. And I said, oh, have you? She said, yes, it's kind of my therapy. It's helping me move forward. It's giving me the confidence. I was always told I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that. So I'm about to prove everybody wrong. And she said, could I write a blog for you? And you post it? Yeah, go for it. So she's written, I think it's about 22 now, blogs, all about her adventures from buying the camper van to kitting it out, to learning how to erect the tent that goes on the back of it. Inner voice telling her constantly that she can't do this. So she calls her inner voice Stanley. And she weaves in little references to her abusive ex-husband, but it's very gently done. And it's very positive. It's quite hopeful. I wanted it to be hopeful. And so did she. And she's had some amazing adventures. And she's now got a new idea, which I'm not going to share. You have to keep an eye out for. But she's started a new project, which I'm also going to host. And again, that's taking it to the next level of her moving forward, really. She wants to help more people with kind of more pragmatic tips on how to move forward. So she's working on that at the moment. So it's great.
Isn't she?
She is, and it's co-production. You know, I've got a bit of a following. I've got the website. She hasn't got that, but she's got all this knowledge. She's a great writer. She's very funny and loads of wisdom. And so we've teamed up, and yeah, she enjoys the freedom of writing and not doing all the hosting and publicising. And I get somebody who is older creating content for me. So it's great.
Oh, that's such a gorgeous collaboration.
She's fabulous.
What do you do then? Because you're working in your day job and then you're doing this as a hobby. What do you do to unwind and, have time for Carrie.
Yeah, I need to get better at this, I'll be really honest. I think something that we are all often guilty of is overworking, and I am very guilty of that. But I've got a really lovely partner who shares the load. I've got a daughter who's 15 now, who's really independent. So life is different. 10 years ago, I was a single parent with a very young child, managing a couple of jobs to pay the bills. Life's really different for me now. And so I've got a bit of privilege that I have a bit of spare time. But I walk the dog. I've got a lovely little dog. I get out in the fresh air. And something I do, which I really love, is I help out my local brownie unit every week. And I get to be really silly. I'm not a leader. I just go and volunteer. I don't have any responsibility. And I go for a couple of hours and I'm really silly and play games and do crafts and just have lots of fun. And so even though I'm talking a lot about a really serious, really emotive topic, I can be really silly and fun as well. And so I make sure I do that.
Oh, that's lovely. That is real, true self-care. What age groups are
7 to 10? And it's like, honestly, it's like therapy. Well, it's like medication. I always say it's like my medication. I go to brownies once a week. That just, any stress from that day or few days just kind of disappears. It's really good fun. Yeah.
Yeah, especially that kind of age group, because they live in the moment.
Yes.
And
it's lovely. They start with you at 7 and a lot, not all of them, but a lot of them come in quite shy and don't feel they've got a voice. And brownies, when I was a little girl, you had to behave yourself and there were really clear rules, and it was very, very kind of
regimental.
And quite, sexist really, in terms of what we as little girls were learning about. And brownies now is very different. It's all about finding your voice, finding your confidence, showing up, and we get them to, speak up and roar and just be themselves. And it's brilliant to see that not only am I kind of working with older generations and hopefully raising the visibility of women, but actually helping that next generation of young girls find their voice. Yeah, it's lovely. It's lovely. But doing it in a really silly, fun way.
That's just gorgeous, Carrie. Is there anything else before we go that in your advocacy work that you'd like to talk about? Or, I don't know, what's for Carrie next, aside from, I know you said earlier that you don't know where it's going to go, but can you always see yourself working in this area?
I've lived and breathed working with people, not just women, people in mid and later life, always. And there's been a couple of times during my career where I've dipped my toe in other waters. I've gone and worked in children's services or different services, and I've always gravitated back to older people. I just think we have so much to learn from those that go before us. And I think often we make, as a society, we're really ageist as a society. And lots of older people are ageist as well. I'm not suggesting that we just all carry internalised ageism. But I think don't make assumptions. Listen. Take the time to really hear what people are telling you. They probably won't trust you at first because they've had years and years of not being able to trust professionals particularly, but anybody, even in your life. But really listen to what that person is telling you, whoever it is, because actually there's probably a story there that they're desperate to share, desperate to be heard, and often aren't.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for sharing your story. Thank you for the work you do, the visibility that you bring, and the awareness to these women that are maybe still suffering in silence today. But thankfully, we now have the podcast, Know Your Place website with the stories, and now the women coming on the podcast to talk about it. Well done. And we look forward to the next series. Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the FEMCAST. We hope it has helped shed light on the critical issues affecting us today. If you or someone you know has experienced anything discussed in this episode, please log on to our website, thefemcast.com, for support services and help. Don't forget to subscribe, rate and review our podcast to help us continue bringing these important conversations to the forefront. Join us next time for more inspiring stories and empowering discussions. Stay strong, stay informed and stay connected. This is the FEMCAST.